Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the old masturbator, and if your family asks you what you're doing in your room, looking at the computer or your iPad, you can tell them I'm watching the old masturbator, masturbating about books and stuff that's on his mind that mean nothing to anybody else. And sometimes he masturbates really well, sometimes he does a terrible job, sometimes he does an excellent job of masturbating, and then I replay the tape maybe a couple of times. And if they don't understand that, they're a bunch of phony dilettantes who don't understand literature, like us. And today I thought this is the only book chat show on the interweb with a blue squirt gun. That's a blue squirt gun. It's for Lucky, her training device, and it's also my wife uses it on me sometimes as my training device. So I've been kind of knocking around this idea, which one of the most pointless and aimless and meaningless ideas I could possibly have to do with these weekly talks is I thought I would do something that's of absolutely no use or interest to anybody, probably except me. But I'm kind of old and I'm kind of a waste of my time anyway. And I thought I would sort of do another series because we don't have enough theme shows. And the new theme show I've decided to do is called Pointless Adventures in Literature, which are basically my pointless adventures in literature. And they're completely arbitrary and capricious. There's a perfect use of the word capricious there because there's no real rhyme or reason to these talks. It's just that there's things as I get older, certain memories, excuse me, allergies, or not the coronavirus, just allergies. I have old memories of meeting writers and people and having friends in literature and my own adventures in literature, and I just feel like talking about it. And I don't have any other reason. And this week I had this really arbitrary connection and memory, so they're kind of based on old memories, and that is I was reading a couple of different books for various reasons. One, I was reading a book by Harlan Ellison and just kind of dipping in and out of called Approaching Oblivion. It's like an early 70s collection of Harlan Ellison's short stories. And I came across a story in there called, from the early 60s, called Polly Charmed the Sleeping Woman. Polly as in a boy's name. Polly Charmed the Sleeping Woman. And it's it's not one of Ellison's best stories. It's an interesting little minor story of his about a jazz player who decides to go play for his dead girlfriend in the cemetery. And there's some nice little jazz writing in it. And about the same time, it reminded me of a story that I'd read years and years ago by a very good friend of mine called Avram Davidson, who you probably have never heard of. I'm going to do 2 talks about Avram back to back. And his story was called Polly Charms, the Sleeping Woman. And it just created one of those little frissons in my head because basically they were old friends. Harlan Ellison and Avram Davidson were old friends probably before I was born. And I had an actual memory of being with both of them at one time. And I thought I would just use this as an arbitrary reason to talk about both of these writers who I knew in different ways. I did not know Harlan Ellison really well. Like many people, I was often on the periphery of groups of people, while Harlan was kind of raging and emoting and kind of charming everybody. He was a very funny guy who liked to talk and liked lots of people around. And I met him when I was very young and had very little one-on-one, but he was a very nice man to me, and he gave me a story. He knew I liked his work when I was a kid, and he gave me one of his stories as a Xerox, back when Xeroxes probably cost a fortune to produce, called The Mouse at the Mouse Circus, which was actually a really good Harlan Ellison story. And so anyway, I'd known Harlan off and on a little bit, and mainly through friends who knew him quite well. And that story just reminded me that, when this story was originally published, Polly Charmed the Sleeping Woman, the editor who bought it was Avram Davidson. And again, many people probably know who Harlan Ellison is. I have my cocktail here for this special inaugural edition of Pointless Adventures in Literature. And Avram was the editor of fantasy and science fiction in the 60s, early to mid 60s, I believe. And he had published in fantasy and science fiction many years, and he went on to publish long after he stopped editing. But Avram was editor there for 3 years and was actually a really good editor. If you go back and see and read some of these old fantasy and science fiction collections, Best of the Year, that Avram edited, that's really some of the greatest stories they ever published. Some of the great classic stories are in there, including Roger Zelazny's wrote for Ecclesiastes, and this great Kit Reed story, Automatic Tiger, The Illuminated Man by J.G. Ballard. Anyway, a lot of amazing stuff was published during Avram's tenure as an editor. And I sort of knew Avram much better. I had a really good kind of personal relationship with Avram. I really liked Avram quite a lot, and he was a quite nice man to me when I was very young as a young writer. He's also a very interesting writer, a very, very complex and challenging writer, and I'm going to talk about him in a separate talk after this one. But as I wanted to talk this just totally personally, which is just my personal experience with him and Harlan, a very brief moment when I was with both of them together. And Avram had written a number of books and short story collections when I met him, and some of the books I really loved when I read them. I read The Phoenix in the Mirror when I was a kid, and it perplexed me and confused me and really, really kind of dazzled me in many ways, because he's kind of a brilliant and very challenging writer. And then lots of his short stories, which we'll talk about. Many of his short stories that were collected in All the Seas with Oysters, or What Strange Stars and Skies had some of his great early fantasy stories. He was a wonderful writer and a very strange, eccentric style that we'll talk about more. And anyway, so I kind of went back and I read this first of story of this book, which is probably my favorite of Avram's books, called The Enquiries of Dr. Esterhazy, and we'll talk about that in the next edition. So anyway, I knew Avram. I took a writing course with Avram when I was 14. That's how I met Avram. And you kind of have to look him up on the web. He kind of looks like a kind of small, slightly grungy Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. Big beard. He was always wearing these weird cloth caps. This is in the 60s and the 70s. And he was a very small, rotund man. I mean, in fact, he and Harlan Ellison, when I was with them at the airport, of course, a 14-year-old, I was towering over both of them. They were both fairly... I think Avram might even be shorter than Harlan, and Harlan was kind of notoriously short. And so he was a small, very round man. He wore lots of wool, cloth, and weird stuff. And he would wear things that at the time when I was a kid looked really unusual in California, like fingerless mittens and so forth. So I took a workshop with him. There was only 4 or 5 of us in the class. One of the people who came to the workshops was one of the first and one of the only writing workshops I was ever involved in. But I remember it with great fondness. And one of the students in there was Grania Davis, who had been Avram's ex-wife. And they had a child together named Ethan, who was nicknamed Frodo, for you know who Frodo is. And Grania I think she was basically lending the pad. She had a lovely little house, really funky house in Sausalito. My dad would drive me there on Monday nights. I mean, 10 weeks, I think it was, or 12 weeks. And Avram would set out these like really nice pastries. He loved sweets and things to eat. And pastries, and we did do workshops. And Grania was really kind of letting us use the house and being part of the workshop, and was easily the best writer there. I sucked. I was terrible. I was like a 14-year-old, terrible, pretentious writer. And there was a couple other writers who were all of them were better than me. But Grania was the one who actually, I think she came out of it and wrote several and published many stories after this in several books. And after Avram died, did a great job of working with people like Michael Kurland, a personal friend of ours here in San Luis Obispo, and another name that's kind of escaping me at the moment. And and she was continued to help keep Avram's work alive, because it kind of vanished, and that's why you don't know about it. I will talk more about his work in the next segment, but those memories I have of Avram was he was a very generous person. He was a very kind of cranky guy. He was always losing his temper, especially with me. I was like 14, and Avram was incredibly erudite. Everyone who talks about the incredible amount of information he had on esoteric subjects, like old Pliny the Elder and ancient history, and peculiar interest in phrenology and any kind of weird crackpot fake science sort of stuff. He liked to understand, learn the mechanisms of it. He wrote about Virgil Magus and some of the magical texts assembled around Virgil Magus in history. and he knew history really well too. He had a really interesting background, which I don't know too much about. He came from a part of Yonkers. I think he was raised speaking Yiddish from a Yiddish family, and he was in the military. He had a very kind of adventurous life. And when I met him, he was a very stable, kind of pleasant, like I said, rotund man who was very, very. Everyone mentions this as well. Cranky and incredibly generous to his friends. He was always thinking about you and sending you clippings he took out of newspapers. And up to the day he died, I was getting clippings from Avram from somewhere in Seattle. I think it was in Washington, state Washington at the time. After taking this course, I still kept in touch with him. I would go visit him all the time in Sausalito. Often I'd be visiting him. He was always staying in people's houses. Avram had no money, it seems, and it was always broke. And he wrote lots of books, but none of them really, they're not the sort of books that are going to fly off the shelves, as we will continue to talk about in the next thing. And I would go to his house. I would go pick him up at places like, it was Frank. I remember we went to go to Frank Herbert's houseboat. Frank Herbert wasn't there. Jack Vance's houseboat. I think both of them had houseboats in Sausalito. And I would go meet Avram at these places, and we would go for walks. And eventually, he lived in the Richmond district of San Francisco, and I ended up going visiting him all the time, and we'd go walk his dog Herman. He had a little weird dog named Herman. I don't know where the hell he got that name from. And I eventually got my first apartment as a grown-up adult, solo, living by myself, was in the Richmond district down the road from him. And we used to, I was thinking of all the things I did with Avram. One of the things, he taught me how to make chicken soup. He taught me how to actually make chicken broth, which I still do it that way, the way Avram showed me. And he taught me how to use snuff when I was like 15. 15 years old. And I was using snuff, which is the most disgusting habit, I guess. I did it for like a year in high school because I thought I was being really cool using snuff. And it basically gets all over you and you're blowing your nose. You got tobacco coming out of your nose. And Avram liked snuff. And I kind of liked it. It gave you a little buzz. And what else did I do with Avram? So it was just this kind of, and when I was like 17, 18, 19, we were neighbors, and we had mutual friends in that neighborhood. It was a lovely area. The old Richmond district in the late 70s was a great kind of Russian Jewish neighborhood, and it's totally changed since then. But it was a terrific little place. There were lots of secondhand bookshops like the Green Apple, and I kind of did all my a lot of my educating there in the Richmond district, especially at the Green Apple bookshop, and the owner there named Dick, who used to give me great books. Everything from William Gaddis to James Jones. And so Avram and I were good friends for years, and kind of lost touch a bit with him. Again, he would often get cranky about you didn't know things. And no one knew less than I did when I was 15, 16. I had no education. I went to high school. I didn't learn anything about history. And Avram was always telling stories. It would be things like, when the Prince Regent of Botswana land was visiting his cousin in the ersatz realm of Pennsylvania. They were out nutmegging one day, and I'm making this up, but he would give these. The Habsburg Empire was always coming up in these stories of Avram's, and I never understood I still don't understand the Habsburg Empire. And there were these very interesting stories which I just didn't understand, and I was constantly asking him, "Well, what's nutmegging?" And he would tell me what it was. Who's the Prince Regent of Alberta? And he would explain the history. And he would just get him so angry. He would get really, really frustrated with me all the time when I'd ask him questions like that. And he really decided. I remember once I said I didn't know who Millard Fillmore was, and Avram got really, really angry with me. So anyway, he was a very cranky and very loving man who I miss very much. He died in the early 90s, and that's totally apart from his work. But these two stories kind of brought me to the time when the one time that I was with both of them together. They were old friends, and to show you what old friends they were, Avram had run this little tiny workshop, and he got Harlan to come fly up. I had met Harlan a couple times before this, but he for his old friend, he flew up from L.A. one evening to come to Sausalito and be our guest writer. And which was very kind of him. In fact, Avram had he had Randall Garrett was there once, and he had for $100 I paid. It was quite an exciting class. And Harlan came up, and did all his emoting and stuff. He told me how my story sucked, and And Avram liked the story, or he said he did, and I think, but Harlan was right. The story really did suck. And at the end of the workshop, we took Harlan back to the airport, and we San Francisco airport. This was long before all the B.J. Cooper stuff happened, and D.J. Cooper, or whoever the hell it was. And you could just walk the people right up to the gate when they were flying away. And I guess as usual, Harlan was late, and we were running to the airport, and I think Grania drove us there, and we were running through the airport, and Harlan was talking a mile a minute all the way through. At one point, I was like a 14, 15-year-old, super skinny, unlike now, hair down to here, terrible acne, just completely hyped up, chain smoking from the time I was 13, just not an attractive figure, I'm sure, walking through the airport. And at one point we were walking along, and some woman, like a I just remember this dark-haired, white, pale woman looking at me with we were walking past them, and she just kind of looked at me and said something snappish, and I don't know what it was, long-haired hippie or something. And Harlan jumped up. He didn't physically. He said, shut up, you old bat. He said something like, shut up, you old bat. He's just a kid or something. And just charged right past this woman with just this incredible, just like he didn't think twice about just jumping all over her. And the whole walk, Avram, who just loved to laugh, he had a really girlish laugh, was just laughing and having a great time, and we took him off. And it was just a really nice little evening. And it was the only time I was ever with those two people together. And it was so clear how much Avram loved Harlan and vice versa at the time. That these two stories, I'm sure that Avram was remembering that title and was playing off Harlan's old title. He wrote an extraordinary story. It's actually one of his better stories, and this is one of his better books, as we'll talk about in the next segment. But I just want to share that as my adventure in literature. Two of the smallest titans of fantastic fiction of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they were both very different writers and good friends, and I enjoyed being with them that one evening. Okay, that's my adventure in literature. This is not worth watching for anybody who wants to talk about books. I'll do Avram in the next section. I'll do him justice, I hope. Okay, bye.